A white passenger strangled a black CEO unconscious with a phone charger, hurling racial slurs the entire time, unaware the cabin was live-streaming straight to Congress. What happens next will leave you speechless. You must join our channel and hit subscribe because only those who believe no black CEO should face violent racial attacks will do it before this story begins. The moment the man across the aisle looked up, everything changed. Jameson Crew had just taken his seat in 1C, first-class cabin of Sovereign Airlines Flight 119, when he felt the weight of eyes on him, calculated, unblinking. Across the aisle in 1D sat a lanky white man in his mid-50s, shoulders hunched but gaze sharp. For a second, Jameson thought the stare was accidental, an unconscious glance one gives a boarding passenger. But it lingered. A second too long, then a third. The man didn't smile, didn't nod, just watched. Jameson adjusted the slim leather briefcase by his feet, unfastened the button on his charcoal gray blazer, and shifted slightly in his seat. The plane's cool air hummed from the overhead vents, and the scent of pine-scented cleaner still hung faintly in the cabin. He looked away first, not out of submission, but because he had no interest in engaging. His mind was elsewhere. His company, Intralume Systems, had just finalized a deal with the Department of Public Infrastructure, a multi-year contract that would redefine how biotech supported public health response. It had taken years, setbacks, and relentless effort to get here. Now he was on his way to testify before the National Oversight Committee in Avonhurst, the capital. This wasn't just about business. It was about legacy. The seatbelt light pinged. A flight attendant passed by, male, mid-20s, thin build, short-cropped hair. His name tag read Ellis. He moved politely down the aisle, offering warm towels with practiced efficiency. Jameson accepted one with a nod. The man across the aisle refused, eyes never leaving his screen now. The tablet in his hands flickered with scrolling headlines and blocky fonts, some fringe site, no doubt. Jameson took a deep breath. He had been through these moments before. The quiet tension, the subtle glares, the unspoken judgments made before he ever opened his mouth. He'd learned to brush them off, to stay focused on the mission ahead. But still, there was something about that stare. It wasn't curiosity. It was something colder, something watching for a slip. He opened his folder and reviewed his notes. Bullet points on ethics in biotech governance, a section highlighting community equity in genome-driven data policies, another on transparency in AI diagnostics. He'd practiced his opening statement a dozen times, but in this silence, his voice felt distant. The hum of the engine, the low rustle of other passengers settling in, and that persistent gaze across the aisle made the air heavier than it should have been. Ellis returned with beverages. "Water or orange juice, sir?" he asked Jameson. "Just water, thank you," Jameson replied, voice calm, posture composed. As the cup reached his tray, a snort came from across the aisle. The man, now leaning slightly toward the center, muttered under his breath, loud enough for Jameson to hear, "Think they'll give you the whole plane next?" Jameson looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. The comment hung in the air like a thin layer of oil on still water. He said nothing. There was a choice to be made in that instant, to confront or to contain. Jameson chose the latter, returning his focus to the notes in front of him, refusing to reward hostility with attention. But that didn't stop the man. He shifted in his seat, scoffing again, this time a little louder, muttering, "Token tech, puppet, riding high on handouts." The flight attendant hesitated. Ellis paused just long enough to catch the change in tone, the way the man's fingers began tapping a strange rhythm on his armrest. He glanced at Jameson, uncertain. Jameson gave him the briefest shake of his head. No scene. Not yet. But he noted the shift, both in the man's voice and in the cabin. Some passengers had started paying attention, side glances, eyes narrowing in curiosity. Most ignored it. A few were too plugged into their headphones to notice anything. Jameson turned slightly, catching the faint reflection of the man in the darkened window beside him. The man's expression was no longer blank. It was agitated, focused, like he was waiting for something, or trying to decide something. That's when Jameson saw it. The man reached into his carry-on and pulled out a phone charger. Not the standard kind. A thick, braided cable model. He began coiling it around his fingers, tight, then tighter, as if testing its strength. It could have been fidgeting, but paired with the expression on his face and the bile in his words, it looked like something else entirely. Jameson's instincts stirred. His father had taught him early. When a man starts preparing for something that hasn't happened yet, watch his hands more than his mouth. Ellis passed by again, and Jameson caught his arm gently. "You might want to keep an eye on 1D, he said quietly. Ellis's eyes flicked across the aisle. "Noted, sir," he said. But Jameson could see the hesitation. What could they do at this stage? The flight was full. The cabin doors were sealed. Taxiing had begun. Jameson leaned back, trying to calm his breathing. He closed his eyes for a moment, but his fingers subtly pressed the call button on his armrest, just once. A signal. An option. In case. The engine roar deepened as the plane rolled forward. Overhead, the cabin lights dimmed into a soft, amber hue. Outside the window, the lights of the runway blurred past. Jameson opened his eyes again and glanced one last time at the man across from him. The tablet was off now. The man was just sitting there, hands still working that cable like a ritual. One loop, then two, then three. Jameson knew the look now. He had seen it before in boardrooms, in public forums, and sometimes, rarely, in the eyes of men who no longer believed they had anything to lose. As the wheels left the ground and the plane tilted upward into the clouded night, a thought passed through Jameson's mind. Not fear, but clarity. This was no longer just a flight. This was a test of what power feared most, a voice it couldn't silence. The cabin lights dimmed, but the shadows were just beginning to rise. Beckett Varn hadn't moved for the first 20 minutes of the flight. He sat upright, legs stiff, fingers pressed tightly around the edge of his tray table. The glow from his tablet screen reflected in his eyes, but he wasn't reading. He was watching. Watching the man across the aisle, the man whose photo he had seen just the day before, headlining a contract win that made his stomach twist. Jameson Crew, the so-called biotech prodigy. The poster boy of everything Beckett believed was wrong with the country's new direction. As the flight leveled out, the seatbelt signs dimmed with a low chime. A flight attendant passed by with a gentle smile, asking if he'd like a beverage. Beckett barely responded, waving her off with a sharp flick of his hand. She moved on, and his eyes returned to Jameson, who was calmly flipping through his printed notes. The man looked too comfortable, too sure of himself, and that irritated Beckett more than anything. He leaned back slowly, muttering under his breath. They hand him the whole pipeline like it's a trophy. They forget who built the damn gate. His voice was too low for anyone to make out the full sentence, but it was enough to make the young steward, Ellis, glance over from the galley. Ellis had been watching Beckett since boarding, a lanky, pale man in his 50s with an ironed plaid shirt, hollow cheeks, and a restless energy that didn't quite match the calm around him. His knees bounced in a steady rhythm. His fingers kept returning to the side pocket of his carry-on. Something about him felt clenched. Ellis took a slow step forward, pretending to check the cabin's seat alignment, but hesitated before speaking. Beckett's eyes flicked toward him, sharp, sudden, piercing. Ellis paused, gave a polite nod, and turned away. Across the aisle, Jameson remained immersed in his work. His notes were organized in a folder labeled NOC Ethics Hearing, Tier 4. He circled a paragraph, adjusted the spacing in his outline, and rechecked the figures on a data chart. Every motion was controlled, quiet. But even in this moment of focus, something tugged at the back of his mind, a subtle awareness that someone was watching. He looked up briefly and met Beckett's eyes. The stare lasted a second too long. Beckett didn't blink. Then, just as quickly, he turned back to his tablet. Jameson exhaled silently. It wasn't the first time he had been stared at like that, but he pushed the thought away. He had bigger things to focus on. Meanwhile, Beckett's fingers moved under the tray table. From his carry-on, he slowly pulled out a charging cable, wrapping it once around his hand, then again. The plastic cord snapped lightly as it tightened. His jaw clenched. No one noticed. At that moment, a quiet buzz from his phone pulsed in his pocket. He pulled it out beneath his thigh, shielding the screen. A single message glowed from an encrypted form app called Vantage Core. Target confirmed. No delays. Your seat is the message. Pull the cord. Beckett's thumb hovered over the reply button. Then he typed, Already in motion. This plane's got a traitor riding high. Time to pull the cord. He hit send. The onboard live streaming camera mounted above the exit row blinked once, its small blue LED too faint to draw attention under the cabin lights. The device had been installed months ago under a federal transparency grant designed to restore passenger trust. It ran silently, its view unobstructed, its lens clear. No one remembered it was there. Ellis returned to the galley and leaned close to his supervisor, a middle-aged steward named Grant. "Sir," Ellis whispered, "Seat 3B. Something's not right. He's tense. He won't stop watching the man across from him." Grant glanced over. "You mean the CEO?" Ellis nodded. "Yeah, he's got something wrapped in his hands. Cable, maybe. He keeps muttering, and his pulse is like, you can see it in his neck." Grant frowned. "Keep eyes on him. But don't escalate. We're full today, and turbulence has been spotted up ahead. Last thing we want is a scene." Ellis nodded hesitantly and turned back toward the aisle. But as he passed, Beckett looked up again, this time with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, a grin that said he had already made up his mind. Jameson, still unaware, reached up to press the attendant button. His voice was calm when Ellis arrived. "Could I get a glass of water when you have a moment?" "Of course, sir," Ellis said, but his gaze flicked again toward Beckett, who had begun rocking gently, tapping his heel against the floor. As Ellis returned to the galley, Beckett spoke, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Think they'll give you the whole plane next?" Jameson froze. He turned slowly, confused. "I'm sorry." But Beckett didn't answer directly. He raised his voice another notch, addressing no one in particular. "First it's the contracts, then it's the seats, then they want the whole sky. That's how it works, right?" A few passengers nearby glanced up. One man across the aisle instinctively pulled out his phone, quietly switching to record. Jameson's posture shifted. He sat up straighter, his face still neutral but alert. He knew not to respond. Not yet, not with emotion. Beckett leaned forward slightly, eyes gleaming with the heat of something long bottled up. "Token tech puppet," he muttered. "Paraded around like a prize." Ellis hesitated in the aisle, tray still in hand. "Sir, I'll have to ask you to keep your voice down." Beckett's head turned sharply. "Am I saying something false?" Ellis didn't respond. The tray trembled slightly in his grip. Jameson spoke, finally. "Flight crew," he said calmly. "If it's possible to be reseated, I'd like that. Please." Grant appeared behind Ellis. "I'm sorry, sir. The cabin is full. We'll handle it." Jameson nodded quietly and returned to his notes, but the calm had broken. Around them, passengers whispered. The atmosphere had shifted, thinner now, heavier, stretched across invisible wires, and still the camera blinked above their heads. Beckett leaned back, the cable still wound in his hand like a secret. His knuckles flexed around it. He mouthed a word that no one heard, and looked once more at Jameson's throat. No one saw the storm gathering, except the camera that never blinked. Beckett moved fast. One moment he was seated, twisting a phone charger cord between his fingers like it was an idle tick. The next, he shot upright, eyes dark with something far deeper than annoyance. Without a word, he lunged across the narrow aisle, catching Jameson completely off guard. The plastic-coated cord whipped out like a snare, looping around Jameson's neck in a single, practiced motion. There was no warning, only a sudden blur of movement and the harsh scrape of shoes against the carpeted floor. Jameson's body jolted backward against the headrest with a sharp thud, the force of Beckett's pull slamming his spine against the seat. His eyes flew open in shock. His hands shot up to his throat, clawing at the cord now digging into his windpipe. Beckett gritted his teeth, the veins in his arms bulging with effort as he leaned in, pressing his weight into the seat back. "You think this is your seat now?" he hissed, his voice low, guttural, and trembling with rage. "You think you earned this?" The passengers closest to the altercation froze. Some gasped. Others instinctively stood, unsure whether to intervene or call for help. A man in a navy suit fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he hit record. The cabin noise dropped, replaced by a stunned silence broken only by the sound of Jameson's choking gasps and the shouts of startled travelers. Jameson struggled, muscles straining, his fingers desperately trying to slip beneath the cord, but it was pulled tight, sawing into his skin. His legs kicked beneath the seat in panic. His vision blurred. He could see Beckett's face inches away, sweat glistening on his forehead, spit clinging to the corners of his mouth. Across the aisle, Ellis, the young flight steward, stumbled backward at the sight. His eyes widened in horror as he reached for the intercom, then turned to his supervisor, his voice cracking. "He's attacking him. We need the captain now." The supervisor, a stern-faced man in his 40s named Raymond Knox, shoved past startled passengers, eyes locked on the scene. "Break it up," he shouted. "Get off him, now." But Beckett didn't flinch. "This isn't your system to control," he barked as if speaking to a crowd. "You don't get to rewrite the rules." Jameson's fingers slipped. He was losing strength, his lips turning pale as his body sagged against the chair. A loud pop sounded, perhaps a tendon straining in the struggle or the armrest snapping from the pressure. Then came motion. A tall man from the second row lunged forward, grabbing Beckett by the shoulders. "Let go of him," he shouted, tugging hard. Another passenger joined in, an older man with silver hair and strong arms honed from years of labor. Together they yanked Beckett backward, breaking his grip on the cord. Jameson fell forward, the cable loosening from his throat. He gasped violently, a wheezing sound that cut through the shocked quiet like a blade. His eyes fluttered, his hands instinctively grabbing the armrests for stability. Red marks wrapped around his neck like angry vines. Beckett staggered as the men shoved him back into the aisle. He didn't resist. His arms hung loose at his sides, the cord still dangling from one hand. He looked not at Jameson but at the ceiling, as if expecting applause. "You'll all see," he murmured, voice suddenly eerie in its calm. "You put them in the sky, but we remember the ground." Knox rushed to Jameson, kneeling beside his seat. "Sir, can you breathe? Stay with me." Jameson tried to speak, but only a rasp escaped. His throat burned like fire. He nodded faintly, blinking through tears, trying to hold on to consciousness. Ellis stood behind the supervisor, hands shaking. "The captain's been alerted. They're contacting ground control. Medics will meet us at landing." "Keep everyone calm," Knox ordered. "Lock the galley. Restrain him now." Passengers murmured, some reaching over to help Jameson sit upright. The man with the phone had tears in his eyes as he kept recording, whispering, This can't be happening." Above them, nestled just below the curve of the overhead bin, a small lens blinked silently. No one looked up. No one remembered it was there, but it had captured everything, every insult, every second of the attack, every panicked breath. The cabin crew moved quickly to secure Beckett in plastic ties, forcing him into the forward galley. He didn't struggle. He smiled. Back in seat 2A, Jameson coughed, a shallow, broken sound. He touched his neck and stared at the blood-tinged plastic cord lying on the floor near his feet. No one moved to pick it up. The silence that followed was thick and haunted, filled with unspoken questions. No one knew what had just been unleashed, not just inside the plane, but outside it. It happened so fast that the entire cabin froze, except for the lens that kept recording. Beckett lunged with terrifying speed. One moment he was seated, silently coiling his phone charger round his fingers, and the next he was out of his seat, teeth clenched, eyes wild, his arms snaking forward like a predator striking. The cable wrapped around Jameson's neck in an instant, yanked back hard against the headrest. The violent motion sent Jameson's tablet tumbling to the floor, clattering between his shoes. The first sound was a gasp, not Jameson's, but a passenger 2 rows back, who blinked as if he hadn't fully processed what he was seeing. Then the chaos hit like a wave. Jameson clawed at the cord, his fingers scrabbling between the tight loop and his skin, his throat constricting as Beckett's grip tightened. The muscles in Beckett's forearms bulged, his knuckles white, face twisted with fury. "This is what you get," he barked, his voice low and venomous. "You sell out the country, and now you want to lead it?" Jameson's mouth opened, but no sound came. His chest heaved. His blazer twisted as he struggled, his legs kicking against the floor, trying to leverage himself upward. Every breath was a battle. The world blurred around him. The ringing in his ears grew louder than the panicked shouts around him. "Stop! Get off him!" shouted a man from across the aisle, his voice shaky but full of intent. He shoved past his tray table and stumbled into the aisle. Another man, a younger passenger with a trimmed beard, leapt from row 3D and lunged at Beckett, grabbing his shoulder. "He's choking him! Pull him back!" But Beckett held firm, hunched like a hunter over his prey. "This is how we restore order," he growled, voice frothing. "You people think you can rewrite everything. Not on my watch." The flight attendants froze for a beat, uncertain, shocked. Then Ellis, the junior steward who had noticed Beckett earlier, shot up from the service station near the galley and pressed the intercom. "Security emergency in first class. Security emergency. Row 2. His voice cracked, but his fingers stayed firm on the button. "Get his arm," yelled the bearded man, now struggling to pry Beckett's hands off Jameson's neck. Another passenger, a tall, heavy-set man in a blue polo, joined him, throwing his weight into the struggle. Beckett resisted, snarling, veins bulging in his neck as he tried to wrench free. Jameson's vision dimmed. He saw flashes, faces morphing, light swirling above the overhead compartments. In the deep recess of his fading consciousness, his thoughts weren't of fear, but of unfinished work. The contract, the testimony, the promise to his grandfather that dignity would never be surrendered. Not like this, not in silence. With a final heave, the two passengers managed to tear Beckett away. The cable snapped off Jameson's throat with a sharp, whip-like sound. Beckett was thrown sideways into the aisle, hitting the armrest with a grunt. His breath came in sharp bursts, his rage undimmed even as one of the men pinned him down. Jameson slumped forward, unconscious. His body leaned awkwardly against the side wall, mouth slightly open, the angry red line circling his neck like a brand. His fingers twitched. His chest barely moved. Ellis dropped to his knees beside him, shaking. "Sir? Sir, can you hear me?" he called, patting Jameson's cheek. "We need help here." A voice behind him shouted, "I know CPR." The man who'd shouted from across the aisle now knelt beside Jameson, counting quickly before starting compressions. 1, 2, 3, come on, come on. A flight attendant ran past with the emergency medical kit. Another crew member radioed to the cockpit. "We need to divert. Medical emergency. Violent passenger restrained." Beckett, now zip-tied with trembling hands by a retired police officer who happened to be on board, sat on the floor breathing hard, sweat streaking down his temple. "You think he's special," he spat, looking up at Ellis, who was still crouched by Jameson. "You think letting him lead fixes anything? He's a placeholder. You take out the symbol, the structure crumbles." Ellis recoiled, eyes wide. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Avonhurst, a very different silence fell. Inside the wood-paneled chamber of the National Oversight Committee, legislators, aides, analysts, and journalists were seated and waiting for the upcoming hearing to begin. They had been watching the new transparency stream from Sovereign Airlines, a pilot program meant to show the safety and civility of air travel in real time. It was meant to be routine, a gesture of trust. Now the image on the screen showed a man being strangled. Gasps echoed across the chamber. Chairs scraped the floor. One lawmaker rose so quickly he knocked his glass of water over. "Is that Jameson Crew?" someone whispered. The video was grainy but unmistakable. The sharp gray blazer, the shocked eyes, the cable around his throat. For a moment, no one moved. Then it was as if the entire room activated at once. Phones were lifted, calls were made, security agents burst into motion, and the committee chairman shouted for the stream to be frozen and forwarded to the Justice Department. In the control room upstairs, a technician stared wide-eyed at the feed, whispering under his breath, "We were just trying to show airline hospitality." But it was too late for containment. The attack was already echoing through newsrooms, surveillance centers, and emergency alerts. The footage was being pulled, clipped, and mirrored faster than anyone could stop it. On social media, it had already been reposted thousands of times. People watched it on buses, in offices, in cafes. It wasn't just a violent moment, it was a question seared into every frame. How could this happen? And on that silent, shaking aircraft with paramedics racing to meet them on emergency descent, a man lay broken but not beaten. The testimony never arrived, but the evidence did. The cord had barely been torn from Jameson's neck when the intercom snapped on with an urgent crackle. "This is the captain. Emergency medical response has been activated. We are making an immediate descent." The flight jolted slightly as the engines adjusted. Inside the cabin, silence had collapsed into chaos. Passengers murmuring, crying, calling out instructions, some still frozen from shock. Jameson's limp body was slumped sideways in his seat, his shirt collar twisted and darkened by sweat and pressure marks. His briefcase had tumbled to the floor, its papers scattered like leaves. A man across the aisle, trembling, pressed down on Jameson's chest with 2 fingers, checking for breath. "He's still with us," he muttered, voice tight. "He's breathing." Beckett Varn sat calmly in the galley now, arms zip-tied behind him, a shallow scrape on his cheek from the scuffle. His chest rose slowly, deliberately, as though none of this had been an accident. Ellis, the junior steward, stood nearby, his hands still shaking as he clutched the phone connected to the cockpit. Beckett turned his head and looked at him with a strange calmness, voice low and steady. "You think he was the first?" he asked. "He's just a symbol. You take out symbols, the structure crumbles." Ellis didn't answer. He didn't move. A sheen of cold sweat coated his brow. The words hung in the air like a fog, dense and poisonous. In the forward cabin, 2 passengers knelt beside Jameson, doing their best to stabilize his head and keep him conscious. His eyes fluttered open briefly, glassy and unfocused, and he tried to speak. Only a rasp escaped. The man beside him, a balding professor in a tweed jacket, leaned closer. "Sir, don't try to talk. Help is coming. Just breathe." Jameson blinked slowly in recognition, but his gaze drifted again, fading. Outside the window, the landscape tilted as the aircraft descended, engines roaring softly. A flashing red notification lit up on the cabin screen. Emergency landing in progress. In first class, passengers clutched their armrests. One man fumbled with his phone, still recording. Another was already on a live call with a news outlet. "Yes, it's all on camera," he whispered. "They're going to land any minute." Unbeknownst to the passengers, the cabin's newly installed government-funded live streaming system had broadcast the entire incident to a room hundreds of miles away, the National Oversight Committee session in Avonhurst, where Jameson had been expected to testify. On the far wall of the committee chamber, the projection had replaced a scheduled ethics briefing with footage of the attack in real time. In the room, filled with senators, advisors, and aides, silence stretched long and painful. The moment Beckett lunged, gasps rippled. No one moved at first. Then an aide stumbled out the door, radioing for security. Chairman leaned forward, hands clenching the sides of the long oak desk. A senator muttered under his breath, "Good Lord, that's crew." By the time Sovereign Airlines Flight 119 touched the runway, emergency crews were already in position. The jet's tires screeched against the tarmac and the aircraft coasted to a halt near a prepared medical response unit. The jet bridge was bypassed. Instead, stairwells were wheeled to the cabin doors, and uniformed paramedics charged inside with stretchers and medical packs. Jameson was barely responsive as they placed a neck brace on him and lifted him onto a gurney. The passengers watched, stunned, as he was carried down the aisle, his eyes open but vacant, throat bruised and swollen. One paramedic spoke urgently into his radio. "Subject is male, early 40s, breathing shallow, pulse erratic, suspected airway trauma, prep trauma unit." Behind them, Beckett was led off separately under heavy guard. Officers flanked him, their expressions grim. He looked neither afraid nor angry, only resolute, as if he had completed some unspoken task. As they reached the top of the stairs, he turned his head, looked back toward the cabin door, and smirked. "Just a symbol," he whispered again. "That's all he was." At Howcroft Memorial Hospital, an elite trauma team was already prepped. Jameson was wheeled through double doors and into a treatment bay where machines beeped steadily. Tubes were inserted, oxygen given, vitals monitored. A nurse turned to one of the attending physicians. "We're getting calls from federal agents. They want status updates every 15 minutes. The physician didn't look up. He was focused on stabilizing Jameson's airway. "Then, let's make sure he survives to hear them." Outside, news crews had already assembled in front of the hospital's emergency wing. Anchors reported live as footage from the cabin replayed across every major news channel. Social media exploded with hashtags, edited clips, slow-motion frames showing the exact moment the cord went around Jameson's throat. Within hours, millions had seen it. In Avonhurst, the National Oversight Committee reconvened in stunned silence. One senator leaned toward the microphone and spoke, his voice rough. "I want an immediate briefing on this. Not tomorrow, not after lunch. Now I want to know who this man was, what group he was part of, and how he got on that flight." Meanwhile, intelligence officers pored over Beckett's belongings. His phone, confiscated on the plane, revealed something far more sinister than personal hatred. Encrypted messaging apps showed threads with dozens of users, coded phrases, flight numbers, and ideological screeds about cleansing the ranks. The group called themselves Restorers of Order, and Beckett wasn't their leader. He was only one piece. Back in the hospital, Jameson briefly opened his eyes as the anesthesia wore off. A young nurse stepped closer and called his name. "Mr. Crew, can you hear me?" He tried to nod. His neck resisted. His throat burned. His eyes welled with moisture, not from pain, but from realization. The attack had reached far beyond him. He wasn't the only target. He wasn't even the end goal. Across the country, people watched and waited. Protesters gathered outside Sovereign Airlines headquarters before midnight, holding signs demanding justice, reform, and accountability. The airline's statement, released hastily, failed to satisfy the growing unrest. Senators called for hearings. Law enforcement raised alerts. Units tracked more chatter from the hate group Beckett had mentioned. It had started as one man on a plane. Now it was something else. What started as one man's flight had become a national reckoning. Jameson's breath rattled beneath the oxygen mask, his chest rising and falling in uneven waves as monitors beeped steadily around him. The hospital room was cold and sterile, its fluorescent lights casting pale shadows across the bruises on his neck. Gauze covered the abrasions where the charging cable had bit into his skin. Nurses moved quietly around the bed, adjusting IVs and checking vitals, but their eyes often lingered a second too long, aware that the man lying there had just become the center of a national storm. Outside, the frenzy had already begun. Footage of the assault played on a loop across every major news network. Jameson gasping, clawing, fading. Beckett Varn's face twisted with fury. Passengers shouting in disbelief. A scene that should have been unthinkable had unfolded 35,000 feet in the air, and now the entire nation was watching it unfold again and again, frame by devastating frame. Talk show panels debated whether this was terrorism. Analysts pored over Beckett's background, his failed business, his radical posts. Social media seethed with outrage, the hashtag number Flight119Truth trending within hours. Protesters gathered outside the Sovereign Airlines corporate headquarters in downtown Cromley. Signs bearing messages like "Safety isn't optional" and "Justice for Jameson" waved in the air. Some held printed stills of Beckett's assault. The wire tightened against Jameson's throat, his eyes wide with disbelief. Chants echoed into the evening air, drowning out the company's attempt at a subdued press conference where their spokesperson delivered coldly rehearsed lines. "We are cooperating with authorities. We deeply regret what occurred." But the anger wouldn't be quelled. Inside a reinforced federal transport vehicle miles away, Beckett sat in silence, handcuffed and secured to a steel bench. His eyes remained distant, unmoved. The officers didn't bother speaking to him. He had barely uttered a word since his arrest. That changed only once, during transfer from the plane to the holding van. Ellis, the junior flight attendant who had helped restrain him, stood nearby, still shaken. "You think he was the first?" Beckett whispered, leaning slightly toward him, voice flat but eerily calm. "He's just a symbol. You take out symbols, the structure crumbles." The words echoed in Ellis's mind long after he stepped out of the van. Back at the Department of Homeland Security's regional field office, investigators combed through Beckett's personal devices. His phone, initially locked, was cracked using software reserved for high-priority national security threats. What they found turned the assault from an isolated incident into something far more chilling. Encrypted threads from a private forum hosted on an obscure dark web server revealed conversations between members of a group calling themselves Restorers of Order. The messages, laced with coded language and historical references, read like a manifesto soaked in fear and resentment. "They've taken the towers of innovation. Now they come for the courts, the air, the future. Stop them where they rise." The forum had dozens of usernames, most still anonymous, but one name, Sentinel-88, matched a handle Beckett had used in online militia groups years ago. He wasn't just inspired, he was part of something. The messages made it clear. This wasn't a spontaneous act of rage. Beckett had been planning it for weeks, if not months. Agents leaned forward in silence as they scrolled past one particularly disturbing exchange. Target acquired, flight confirmed. Symbol in seat 2B, cord method, quiet, symbolic. Even more alarming were the multiple references to other flights with words like flagged, in position, and prime exposure. There were photos attached, boarding passes, seat maps, candid images of black and brown passengers, many of them prominent figures in government, science, or business. It wasn't just Jameson. He was one of several targets. In the debriefing room, Agent Thomas Greer, a seasoned DHS analyst, stood up and turned to his team. His face was pale. "We've got a coordinated campaign," he said, tapping the screen. "This wasn't some angry loner. This is networked domestic extremism, radicalized ideology aimed at erasing visibility in power structures. This is terrorism," his voice sharpened. "One assault had been caught on camera. How many more were in motion?" Jameson's eyes opened to a sterile white ceiling, the scent of antiseptic thick in the air. A faint beep pulsed steadily beside him. The room was still, yet buzzing beyond its walls. He could sense it before he even turned his head. His throat burned, raw and tight, as if the cord was still wrapped around it. Breathing felt like swallowing shards. He winced as he shifted slightly, every muscle aching, every breath labored. He didn't need to remember what had happened. It was imprinted in his body like a brand. Sitting beside him, illuminated by the soft flicker of a heart monitor, was Miles Tanner. The young man looked up from a tablet, his brown eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep but still sharp, alert. His frame was stiff in the plastic chair, one leg jittering restlessly. "They're watching it on loop, Jam," Miles said quietly, his voice thick with concern. "News anchors, lawmakers, students, protesters, everyone." Jameson didn't answer. His lips parted, but only a breath escaped. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to summon the will to speak, to focus through the fog in his head. Miles leaned in closer, pressing a button to raise the bed slightly. "You didn't just survive," Miles added, his voice firmer now, holding back a tremor. "You became a symbol." Jameson turned his head slowly toward him, face pale against the white pillow. His jaw clenched. He hated that word, symbol. He hadn't boarded that flight to inspire outrage. He had boarded it to do his job, to testify before the National Oversight Committee about ethical frameworks for biotech innovation. He wanted to talk about integrity, about what his company stood for. Not violence, not blood, not fear. He blinked slowly. The sterile light above hummed. Somewhere down the hall, the sharp wheels of a gurney echoed against tile. "I didn't ask for this," Jameson rasped finally, voice barely more than a whisper. "I know," Miles said. He sat back, rubbing his palms together. "But the world's watching now, and they're not seeing a businessman. They're seeing someone who stood in the line of fire and didn't disappear." Jameson looked away. He stared at the IV pole beside him, its plastic bag dripping methodically into his arm. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence between them was heavy. Then the door opened. A man in a dark gray suit entered. Short-cropped hair, square shoulders, a Homeland Security badge clipped to his belt. He moved like a man who'd delivered bad news more than once. "Mr. Crew," he said with practiced calm, "I'm Agent Kessler. I need to ask you a few questions." Jameson's gaze drifted back toward him, slow but unflinching. "Was there any indication you received threats prior to the flight?" Kessler asked, stepping beside the bed, his tone clinical. Jameson shook his head faintly. "Number nothing," he rasped. Kessler nodded and jotted something into his tablet. "No strange packages? Emails? Online harassment?" "I get attention," Jameson said, voice sandpaper rough. "Not this." Behind Kessler, Miles stepped in, folding his arms. "Is he cleared for this? He just regained consciousness?" Kessler turned to him. "We're dealing with something larger than one incident. We need to know if Mr. Crew was targeted or if this was part of a wider plan." Jameson looked between them, his mind racing, even through the haze. A single phrase from Beckett kept surfacing. "Take out the symbol." He didn't know what it meant, not yet, but it echoed like a riddle begging to be solved. "I want to be released," he said suddenly. Kessler blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I want to leave," Jameson repeated, each word slow, deliberate. "I need to finish what I started." "Mr. Crew," Kessler began cautiously, "you were nearly strangled unconscious in front of an entire nation. You need to rest. We're still assessing risk." But Jameson was already struggling to sit upright, wincing as the pain flared down his spine. Miles rushed forward, hands out. "Jam, wait, just breathe. What are you trying to do?" Jameson grabbed Miles's wrist gently, anchoring himself. "I came to testify," he said. "That hasn't changed." Miles looked at him, stunned. "You're in a hospital bed. You can barely talk." Jameson's expression hardened. "Then I'll whisper into the microphone if I have to." Kessler frowned. "I'll have to inform security. There will be heavy protocols if you go public, especially this soon." Jameson's hand tightened slightly around the bedsheet. "They tried to choke my voice out," he said, staring straight ahead, jaw set despite the bruises lining his neck. "Then my answer is to speak louder. If that moment made your blood boil and your heart ache, don't stay silent. Subscribe and become a member, because standing against hate is how we reclaim dignity." The report hit like a thunderclap. Just hours after Beckett Varn's violent attack aboard Flight 119 had dominated the nation's airwaves, a confidential file began circulating among key officials at the Department of Civil Aviation. The file wasn't a public statement. It was an internal whistleblower leak, a scanned set of emails, security logs, and heavily redacted incident reports from within Sovereign Airlines' internal security division. It painted a disturbing picture, one that extended far beyond a single deranged passenger. Beckett Varn should never have been allowed on that flight. He had a documented history. 3 separate airlines had filed incident reports against him over the last 18 months, 2 for verbally harassing black passengers, 1 for threatening a flight attendant who asked him to adjust his carry-on. But none of those reports had been flagged in Sovereign's passenger risk system. Not because the system failed, but because someone made sure those reports never reached the system at all. Miles Tanner sat in the corner of the hospital room, Jameson's medical chart balanced on his lap, but his eyes were glued to his tablet. The anonymous leak had reached his inbox through a secure line just 10 minutes ago. His face was pale, his jaw clenched tight as he scrolled through the messages. "Jam," he said softly, not sure if the man resting beside him was awake. "You need to hear this." Jameson's eyes opened, faintly bloodshot but focused. His throat was too sore to speak, so he simply nodded. Miles continued, his voice hushed and tense. "An internal security analyst at Sovereign sent this. It's real. They buried complaints. About Beckett. About others, too." Jameson's brow furrowed. He tried to sit up, but the brace around his neck protested. The beeping of the machines nearby punctuated the silence between them. Miles read aloud from one of the leaked emails. "We should be extremely cautious about escalating passenger complaints that involve black professionals or public figures. The optics of enforcement skew unfavorably, and Sovereign's brand cannot sustain the narrative of racial confrontation. Better to de-escalate quietly or issue internal advisories without FAA involvement." He looked up. "This is from the head of risk management, sent last year." Jameson blinked slowly, a flood of anger and understanding moving through him all at once. It wasn't just that Beckett got through. It was that someone opened the door and looked the other way. As the leak gained traction, media outlets scrambled to verify. By nightfall, the story broke wide open on a primetime news broadcast. Footage of the attack was still fresh in viewers' minds when the anchor dropped the next bombshell. Sources close to Sovereign Airlines confirmed that prior complaints about Beckett Varn's in-flight behavior were known but never reported to federal authorities. A whistleblower has provided documentation indicating a pattern of systemic suppression of passenger complaints, especially those involving racial harassment. Outside Sovereign's headquarters in Erinvale, protesters began gathering by the dozens, then by the hundreds. They held signs that read, "Accountability is not optional," and "Safe skies for everyone." Security guards tried to usher media away from the entrance, but the press vans kept arriving, one after another. Inside the executive suite on the 28th floor, Sovereign's crisis team was already in freefall. The chairman, Ronald Rusk, a tall, silver-haired man with the clipped speech of a former naval officer, paced in front of a wall of darkened screens. He had just gotten off a call with the Senate Oversight Committee. The message had been clear: appear for a closed-door inquiry or expect subpoenas. "This was supposed to be a routine route," Rusk muttered, voice low and brittle. "One damn flight." A younger executive, Gavin Mars, head of public communications, swallowed hard. "It's not just one flight anymore, sir. They're saying this goes back years." Another man, Clark Densley, director of passenger security, stood by the window with a phone pressed to his ear, his free hand trembling as he listened. "We're exposed," he whispered, hanging up. "If we don't come forward with everything, they'll come for it themselves." The documents were damning. One email thread referred to a file labeled Media Sensitivity Index, which ranked passengers by their risk to public relations damage. Jameson Crew was near the top, flagged not for danger, but for influence. The directive beside his name read, "Discreet handling." Avoid escalation. No written incident logs unless FAA requires that alone was enough to ensure Beckett would never be flagged, because no one was ever allowed to file a full report in the first place. At the hospital, Miles stepped into the hallway to speak with Agent Victor Wren from Homeland Security. Wren was a solid-built man in a Navy suit, his voice calm but urgent. "This wasn't negligence," Wren said. "It was calculated omission. Whoever ran this program knew exactly what they were avoiding. And they weren't just protecting passengers, they were protecting the brand. even if it meant putting lives at risk. "Is this going to stop?" Miles asked, voice low. "Not unless it becomes too expensive to continue," Wren replied, turning away. That night, under growing public pressure, Sovereign Airlines released a prepared statement that backfired almost immediately. The statement expressed deep concern over the incident involving Mr. Crew, but avoided naming Beckett and made no mention of the suppression scandal. Social media exploded. Boycott Sovereign trended within 20 minutes. Pilots and flight attendants, many anonymous, some brave enough to show their faces, began sharing stories of being told to keep things quiet when racial harassment occurred in the cabin. One video featured a former crew member stating, "We were told not to log verbal complaints unless there was physical contact. Even then, if the passenger was important, we had to get approval before submitting the report. I knew one day it would go too far." That day had come. In the Senate, wheels turned fast. Subpoenas were drafted. The Transportation Ethics Council called for an emergency review of all major carriers' internal security protocols. Public trust in Sovereign plummeted. Stock prices followed. Journalists unearthed even more emails. Some suggested that corporate leadership had tried to partner with lobbying firms to quietly kill proposed oversight measures that might have prevented Beckett from ever boarding Flight 119. Back in his hospital bed, Jameson watched the coverage silently, his hand resting gently on the edges of his neck brace. He didn't need to say anything. The world had begun connecting the dots. Miles looked at him, voice soft with something like awe. "They tried to bury this, Jam, but now it's everywhere." Jameson didn't smile. He didn't flinch. His eyes stayed on the screen, where protesters held signs outside Sovereign headquarters and lawmakers paced the marble halls of the Capitol building. They thought hiding the fire would stop the burn, but now everything was catching flame. Jameson stepped into the committee chamber without warning. The doors had barely opened before the room fell into a deep, heavy silence. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Lawmakers turned, staffers froze, and the sound of leather chairs creaking echoed louder than it should have. Cameras that had been idling on the panel members slowly pivoted to capture the figure now moving down the aisle. He didn't need to say a word yet. His presence was already louder than any voice. Dressed in a simple navy blue suit, Jameson Crew moved deliberately, one foot slightly dragging from fatigue, the other guiding him toward the center. A stiff white neck brace framed his jawline, the bruises along his throat still dark, mottled reminders of the violence he had endured. In his hand, barely visible to the cameras but unmistakable to those who noticed, was a crumpled, blood-stained boarding pass. The room had not expected him. 3 days earlier, the nation had watched his assault unfold in real time, and most believed he was still in recovery. The committee's agenda had already been restructured to account for his absence. But now, here he was, walking in without announcement, without protection, without ceremony. He didn't stop to greet anyone. No handshakes, no nods. Just a slow, steady march up to the tall wooden podium, the kind reserved for experts, whistleblowers, and, in rare cases, history makers. He placed the boarding pass on the podium gently, as if it were made of glass. Then, looking up, he locked eyes with the camera lens ahead. The cameras zoomed in instinctively, framing the moment with precision. The feed went live instantly, picked up by every major news outlet already monitoring the hearing. When Jameson finally spoke, his voice was raspy, the strain evident in every syllable, but his tone was composed, measured. "I came here to speak about ethics in innovation," he began, his eyes not on the senators but on the nation watching beyond the chamber walls. "But life changed the subject." He paused, not because he needed breath, though he did, but because silence had become his most powerful tool. Everyone leaned forward. Phones stopped buzzing. Even the air vents seemed quieter. "I'm not here to talk about a man," he said, his voice rising just slightly, the pain in his throat bending the notes but not the meaning. "I'm here to talk about a mindset, one that believes some people don't belong, one that sees progress not as something to build, but something to fear." The room held still, transfixed. Jameson's gaze swept across the chamber, landing momentarily on each lawmaker, each aide, and each of the stern-faced guards stationed near the exits. "You gave me a seat at this table," he said slowly, "but that seat didn't come without a cost. I paid it 35,000 feet above the ground with a cord around my neck." Several men in the audience lowered their heads, a few blinking rapidly, unsure whether it was the lighting or something deeper pressing behind their eyes. "I don't want sympathy," Jameson continued more firmly now. "I want change. Real, structural, measurable change. Because if it can happen to me, a man you invited to testify on behalf of national ethics, then it can happen to anyone." A ripple of unease passed through the chamber as the weight of that truth settled. Jameson leaned slightly forward, bracing himself on the podium. The tension in his shoulders betrayed the pain he was still enduring, but it also underscored something deeper: resolve. "What I faced on that flight wasn't just violence," he said, quieter now. "It was a message that certain seats are still up for debate, that no matter how far some of us come, there are those who want to pull us down. But let me be clear. You can't choke progress. You can't strangle dignity." He tapped the boarding pass once, lightly, like a judge's gavel. "This is what I brought," he said. "Not a slideshow, not a graph, just this. Proof that even when silence is forced, the truth still lands." No one moved, no one dared. Then, as if prompted by an invisible cue, one of the committee members stood, then another, and another. A full standing ovation unfolded, not loud or theatrical, but solemn, respectful, and earned. Several attendees clapped, their expressions unreadable, unsure whether to cheer or apologize. Some just kept clapping, afraid that stopping would mean losing the moment too soon. Behind the cameras, a team of legislative aides was already shifting. In back rooms and offices, policymakers were updating review documents, changing language in bills, accelerating protocols. Policy reforms that had been languishing in red tape now surged to the front of the line. Screening algorithms, live stream requirements, domestic threat monitoring, everything was in motion. Jameson didn't linger for applause. He stepped down from the podium, nodded once to the panel, and turned toward the doors. Miles Tanner, his assistant, waited quietly at the end of the aisle, ready to guide him out. The chamber remained standing, silent in his wake. One voice, almost stolen, had now changed the course of the entire system. The courtroom lights flickered slightly as the charges were read aloud: attempted murder, hate crimes, conspiracy to incite violence across state lines. Beckett Varn stood in a drab orange jumpsuit, his face unreadable, shoulders slumped but eyes still glinting with something feral. The prosecutor's voice echoed through the chamber, detailing the attack on Jameson Crew in clinical, horrifying detail. Jameson wasn't present, but the weight of his absence filled the room like smoke. Outside, cameras flashed, news vans blanketed the courthouse steps, and across the nation, people clutched their phones in disbelief, not only because of what had been done, but because of what had almost happened next. 2 days after Beckett's arrest, 2 separate incidents rocked the aviation world. On a flight to Marinford, a man in his 30s, clean-shaven, polite, unremarkable, was stopped at a security checkpoint when a suspiciously coiled charger in his carry-on triggered inspection. It looked like an ordinary cord until investigators unwrapped it to find it reinforced with a threaded inner lining, capable of being used as a garrote. The man's phone contained encrypted chats linking him directly to Beckett's extremist forum. His boarding pass, chillingly, was for a flight with a black city councilman seated in first class. The second arrest came only hours later. Another man on a flight to Caldenhurst was pulled from his seat mid-flight after a passenger overheard him mumbling the phrase, "Another strike for the order." His bag held a nearly identical charging cable. A subsequent raid of his home revealed manifestos, maps, and even photos of tech executives of color. The pattern was undeniable. Beckett hadn't acted alone. He was part of a growing, coordinated effort to target high-profile minorities, especially in science, government, and infrastructure. As the reports spread, the public reeled. Social media platforms were flooded with disbelief, outrage, and urgent questions. How deep did this go? How many more were out there? But for Jameson, watching the coverage from his office, the shock had begun to harden into something sharper: resolve. He sat in the quiet conference room of Intraloom Systems, the walls still lined with charts and reports on AI ethics and national health logistics. The attack had delayed him, but it hadn't derailed him. Instead, it had refocused him. His voice, nearly taken from him, now carried more weight than ever. "We move forward," Jameson said quietly, his voice still gravelly from the trauma to his throat. Across the table sat Miles Tanner, his assistant, looking pale and visibly shaken. "Are you sure about the launch?" Miles asked, tapping the tablet that displayed a bold header, Blackline Airwatch, Draft Framework. Jameson nodded slowly. We need oversight. Not from the airlines, not from the regulators who keep missing the signs, but from people who understand what's really at stake. That same day, Jameson publicly announced the creation of Blackline Airwatch, an independent nonprofit dedicated to tracking racial profiling and targeted harassment across transportation systems. Within 24 hours, their website crashed under the volume of traffic. Donations poured in from across the globe. Former pilots, security officers, tech volunteers, all men offered their help. Jameson declined interviews but released a written statement that was shared by every major outlet. We cannot prevent what we refuse to see. Blackline exists to make sure the world sees. Meanwhile, Intralume's stock began to climb, unexpectedly and sharply. Market analysts noted that federal agencies had quietly expanded their integration with Intralume's ethical AI infrastructure, praising its secure design and anti-bias logic models. Investors now saw Jameson not as a victim, but as a visionary who had survived one of the most publicized hate crimes in aviation history and responded with action, not fear. But Jameson remained focused. Headlines didn't matter. Change did. On the fifth night after the attack, he stood alone in his office. The city lights of Avonhurst stretched far beyond the windows, blinking like beacons. He stared at the still image on the screen in front of him, captured from the plane's live stream feed. It showed Beckett's face twisted in rage, the cord, midair, Jameson's hand just reaching up to defend himself. Frozen violence, forever archived. A knock on the glass wall behind him broke his thoughts. It was Miles again, holding a notepad. "You're trending," he said with a forced smile. "#1 across 3 platforms." Jameson didn't look away from the screen. "Let it trend. Just make sure we're building something while they watch." Miles nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "They'll ask you what you remember most." "From that moment," he said, "when it happened." Jameson was quiet for a long time. Then, finally, his lips parted and he spoke, softly, with conviction. "The silence in my ears, but not in my spirit." A white envelope lay on the center of the conference table, out of place among the neatly arranged tech blueprints and regulatory charts. It hadn't gone through security. No postage mark. No return address. Miles Tanner, Jameson's assistant, stared at it for a moment before carefully sliding on a glove and peeling the flap open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, plain and typed, but unmistakably deliberate. "Take out the symbol." Miles froze. His jaw clenched as he handed the letter to the nearest security agent without saying a word. The agent's brow tightened instantly, and within seconds, the room that had buzzed with quiet concentration shifted into urgency. Jameson, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the downtown skyline, turned before anyone spoke. He knew that silence, that breathless pause before a storm. "What is it?" he asked, already sensing the answer. Miles approached with calm urgency, holding out the message. Jameson read it once and lowered the page slowly. No dramatic gasp, just a tightening of the eyes. A familiar phrase now echoed in a new setting. The same words Beckett Varn had whispered with venom on Flight 119. Security staff immediately began sweeping the office floor. A detail was assigned to Jameson personally, and new protocols were rolled out. All public itineraries were locked down. Staff movement was limited. Still, none of it seemed to rattle Jameson outwardly. He moved through the day's meetings with a focused calm, though inside, a pressure was mounting. There was no time to be afraid, no room to recoil, not when Blackline Airwatch was finally making impact. Within weeks of its launch, the nonprofit had exploded in scale. What began as a few analysts and legal volunteers ballooned into a nationwide network of aviation veterans, technologists, civil rights watchdogs, and citizen reporters. Their mission: to track, record, and hold accountable instances of passenger mistreatment and bias on commercial airlines. Jameson had led the charge personally. The app, Blackline Signal, was built to be secure, anonymous, and tamper-proof. It allowed passengers and crew to report incidents in real time, accompanied by time-stamped videos or witness logs. Within days of release, it was overwhelmed with submissions. Hundreds poured in the first week. By the second week, it was thousands. Some accounts were fresh and raw. Others came from years past, buried in silence until someone finally asked. The headquarters became a war room. Digital maps dotted with red markers showed active investigations. A large screen displayed graphs of complaint types: verbal abuse, discriminatory seat shuffling, denied service, unwarranted detainment. It was all there, no longer hidden. And yet Jameson knew this was why the letter had arrived. "You've rattled something," Miles said one evening as they reviewed the case files. "No," Jameson replied, rubbing the edge of his temple. "We've exposed something. Now it's reacting." That night he stayed late. As the lights dimmed and most staff cleared out, Jameson stood in front of the situation board, reviewing every pin, every thread of red yarn connecting clusters of incidents to airlines, airports, and law enforcement liaisons. Patterns were emerging, patterns no one wanted to admit existed. His phone buzzed. It was a message from a Blackline volunteer named Preston, a former flight coordinator. The message read, "Jameson, we found 3 flagged flight reports where victims mentioned hearing the phrase, 'take out the symbol,' before your incident. The earliest one is dated 6 months ago. Different attackers, same words." Jameson read it twice, then sat down. It was bigger than Beckett. It always had been. The next morning, he was due to appear at a private security summit in Grayston to speak on biometric ethics in transit systems. Miles arrived early, clearly rattled. He paced Jameson's office with a guarded restlessness. "I've asked again for us to postpone Grayston," he said, adjusting his cuff nervously. "We don't know how far this network reaches. There are too many variables, too many threats now." Jameson listened, then stood and walked to his coat rack, slipping on the same gray blazer he wore the day of the attack. He adjusted the collar, checked his reflection, and picked up a folder of prepared remarks. "If we vanish into silence," he said without raising his voice, "then they win by default." He met Miles' eyes, steady and unflinching. "We speak. We move. We lead." Callum Varn waited outside the secured lobby of Intraloom's downtown headquarters, his shoulders stiff beneath a faded canvas jacket. The afternoon air carried a chill, and he clutched a small flash drive in his right hand like it might burn through his palm. He didn't belong here. He knew it. The marble walls, the glass revolving doors, the badge scanner, all of it felt like a world built to keep men like him out. But today, he had come with purpose. Shame had kept him silent for years. That silence had grown heavy, and after watching what his brother had done on live television, he could carry it no longer. Inside, Jameson Crew stepped out of a quiet meeting with his legal counsel, his throat still sore from recent surgery. When his assistant, Miles Tanner, approached and whispered, "There's a man here. Says he's Beckett Varn's brother." Jameson's brow furrowed, but he didn't hesitate. "Bring him up," he said, his voice strained but steady. The private conference room was quiet, tucked into the far corner of the executive wing, its large windows casting long beams of sunlight across the polished floor. Callum entered slowly, removing his cap and holding it against his chest. He looked nothing like Beckett. Slighter build, tired eyes, a nervous kind of decency. "Mr. Crew," he began, his voice low, "I don't expect you to want anything to do with me, but I need you to see this." Jameson studied him for a long moment, then gestured to the seat across the table. "I'm listening." Callum set the flash drive down and slid it forward with the tip of his fingers. "That's everything I could gather. Voice recordings, group chat logs, snippets of private calls. Some of it's from my brother's old backups. Others came through friends who stayed in contact with him when I couldn't." Jameson's fingers hovered over the drive, but he didn't touch it yet. "Why now?" Callum looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because for a long time, I thought I could just forget. Pretend he wasn't the person I feared he'd become. But when I saw what he did to you on that plane..." His voice faltered and his hands clenched. "He could have killed you, and the worst part is, he didn't do it alone." Jameson finally took the drive and held it in his palm, weighing more than just its physical presence. "What am I going to find on here?" Callum exhaled slowly. Names, meetings, plans. They called themselves the Restorers of Order. Sounded like some fringe nonsense at first, but it wasn't. It was layered, structured, like a quiet army. As he spoke, Jameson noticed the tremor in Callum's hand. This wasn't just guilt, it was fear. And for good reason. "They used encrypted messaging apps," Callum continued, pulling out a folded list. "But Beckett liked to keep a copy of everything. Even his paranoia had limits. He thought they might try to scapegoat him one day. So he kept recordings, voice clips. He even talked to men on the inside, government employees, Airport security, airline staff. Jameson's expression darkened. Airline staff? Callum nodded. You weren't supposed to be the only one, Mr. Crew. There were others marked for harassment. Maybe worse. A few were traveling alone. One was a student from Hartwell Tech. Another was a civic planner en route to speak at a zoning conference. All minorities, all high profile. The plan was about visibility. Make a scene. Send a message. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the quiet hum of the building's ventilation. Jameson leaned back, mind racing. Why didn't you go to the police? I'm not proud of it, Callum admitted. I told myself I didn't have enough. I told myself it wasn't my fault. But when I saw your face, when I heard the sound of him choking you, I knew I'd waited too long. Jameson stood and paced slowly to the window, eyes locked on the skyline. Did your brother ever talk about the people backing him? Callum shook his head. Not directly, but he referenced contracts, access codes, and even talked about audits he'd bypassed. He had contacts with clearance. Some of them I recognized from my old union circles. Others were names I only found through reverse searches. One was listed as a logistics officer for a private security firm that supplies airport screeners. Jameson turned back, his eyes sharper now. If this is real, and it sounds like it is, then this goes far beyond one man's anger. Callum nodded. Beckett wasn't the mastermind. He was a matchstick. Someone else lit the fuse. Miles entered the room quietly, signaling that federal investigators had just arrived downstairs, summoned by a discreet text Jameson had sent earlier. Jameson placed the flash drive gently into a sealed evidence envelope. They're going to want everything, he told Callum. Take it, Callum said. I don't want it in my house anymore. As they stepped out of the conference room together, sunlight stretched longer across the floor, cutting sharp shadows beneath their feet. The hallway felt different now, charged with a new urgency. Jameson knew what came next wouldn't be easy, but it would be necessary. He glanced at Callum one last time, offering a nod of silent respect. And as agents took possession of the drive and the data within began to unravel a far wider conspiracy than anyone had guessed, one thought echoed in Jameson's mind. The man on the plane wasn't the mastermind. He was just a matchstick. The moment the Department of Homeland Security file landed on Jameson Crew's desk, he knew things were shifting again. The folder bore no markings on the outside, just a small brass clip binding the edges, and a faint scent of printer ink still clinging to the paper. He opened it slowly, careful not to let his shaking fingers show too much. Inside were 5 documents, each detailing a new federal initiative, predictive threat detection using machine learning, tailored specifically for aviation. And at the top of the proposal was a request for partnership with Intraloom Systems. He sat back in his chair, silent, the low hum of the office's central air a dull counterpoint to the rising questions in his mind. They weren't just asking for his company's software. They wanted his oversight, his ethics protocols, his name stamped onto a nationwide security framework. The same agencies that had once ignored voices like his were now asking for leadership. But Jameson knew better than to accept blindly. He stood, walked over to the large window overlooking the city skyline, and pressed his palm to the glass. The sun was low, casting gold on the buildings, and the traffic below looked like blood pulsing through metal veins. He picked up the phone and dialed his assistant. Miles, he said, his voice steady but low, set a meeting with the agency. But tell them this won't happen unless independent boards are involved, not just in review, at the decision-making table, and I want people there who've been overlooked, displaced, silenced. Yes, sir, Miles replied, already typing. 2 days later, the conference room at Intraloom's downtown headquarters buzzed with tension. Jameson stood at the head of the table, facing a delegation of federal officials. Men in dark suits adjusted their ties, cleared their throats, tried to hide the unease in their eyes. We need your framework, said Director Langford, the lead representative from DHS. Your AIA's pattern detection systems are the most advanced we've seen. If we can identify coordinated hate threats before they reach the airport, we can stop them entirely. Jameson studied the man's face. It was earnest, perhaps even a little desperate. But sincerity alone didn't guarantee accountability. He replied slowly, clearly. This technology won't be another tool used blindly, not under my name. You want Intraloom Systems, you get our ethics models. And our terms. Langford hesitated. You mean external review? No, Jameson corrected. Internal authority. I want an independent oversight board embedded into the entire process. Not just a formality. Real leadership. Real voices. A heavy pause filled the room. One of the junior agents shifted in his chair. Another scratched notes into a notepad. Then Langford nodded. Done. Outside the room, reform had already begun to ripple. Following the revelations about Beckett Varn and the extremist cell he belonged to, the airline industry scrambled to adapt. Public confidence was shaken, and scrutiny was unrelenting. By mandate, all commercial carriers were now required to install live streaming cameras in cabin sections, high-definition feeds monitored in real time by both airline control and federal transportation boards. It was no longer just a security measure. It was a shield against silence. Airlines rushed to retrain their crews. De-escalation workshops were revamped. Racial sensitivity training, once brushed off as optional, became an enforced standard. Jameson's nonprofit, Blackline Airwatch, became more than a watchdog. It was now a partner. Its monitoring interface, crisp and intuitive, was licensed by 6 major carriers. Real-time dashboards now tracked incident reports, flagged trends, and spotlighted routes with repeated complaints. Blackline wasn't just watching, it was warning. But amid the wave of change, Beckett's sentencing loomed. Prosecutors had uncovered the full scope of the conspiracy. Digital logs, voice notes, forum screenshots, all of it painted a picture of calculated, ideology-fueled violence. The plea deal arrived quietly. Beckett Varn, once the symbol of a single horrific attack, had become the thread that unraveled a larger hidden web. He admitted guilt to charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, and hate crimes across state lines. The news splashed across headlines. The network had been broken, but at a cost. Jameson sat alone in his office when the court date came. He had the option to attend. A front-row seat to justice. A moment of confrontation. Instead, he reached for a pen and drafted a public statement. He wrote slowly, deliberately, pausing after each line. He folded the paper, handed it to Miles, and said quietly, "Release it." Hours later, the words appeared on screens across the nation. Simple, clear, not vengeful, but unwavering. Justice is not about revenge, it's about interruption. Let this be the last time anyone ever brings a weapon of hate into the sky. The wheels lifted from the tarmac with a low rumble as Flight 74 ascended into the cloud-veiled sky, but Jameson Crew didn't flinch. He sat in Seat 3A, one hand resting lightly on the armrest, the other gently gripping a slim leather portfolio. Beside him, in Seat 3B, was Elijah Rhodes, a wide-eyed 17-year-old scholarship recipient from Intralume's STEM outreach program. The boy kept glancing around the cabin, his excitement barely contained behind a pair of large wire-rimmed glasses. But Jameson remained quiet, eyes fixed forward, his breathing measured. Only minutes earlier, the captain himself had stepped into the aisle, his uniform crisp, his voice steady as he leaned in and said, "Mr. Crew, it's an honor. What you did, it changed everything. On behalf of this crew, thank you." The captain had extended a hand, but Jameson had instead placed a firm hand on his shoulder, nodding once. "Just keep flying with integrity," he said. The moment passed like a gentle wave, unnoticed by most, but to Jameson it carried weight. This was the first time he'd flown again since the attack. The cabin had changed, not just in layout or lighting, but in presence. The crew was noticeably more diverse, the safety briefings included new protocols for de-escalation, and mounted visibly near the front bulkhead was a compact live-stream display panel, activated and blinking, its quiet red light offering subtle reassurance. Security personnel were discreet but evident, one seated near the emergency exit, another near the galley, both blending in but unmistakably watchful. Elijah turned to Jameson, bouncing slightly in his seat. "You've done this a lot, right? Traveled to summits?" Jameson gave a faint smile, his voice raspier than it used to be, still recovering from trauma. "Enough to know the world listens differently depending on who's speaking." The boy furrowed his brow. "Is that why you chose me? Because I've got something to say?" "You've got something the world needs to hear," Jameson replied, adjusting the cuff of his tailored charcoal suit. "And I'm here to make sure you get there." Outside the window, the clouds were soft and endless. But inside, the silence settled thick for a moment, and Jameson's eyes dropped to the faint scar beneath his collar. It didn't hurt anymore, but it reminded him. He thought of Beckett Varn's twisted face, the wire pulled tight around his throat, and the moment the world had stopped pretending this kind of hatred didn't board planes. From the seat ahead, a soft ping echoed as the flight attendant passed down the aisle. "Warm towel, Mr. Crew?" the attendant asked. Jameson declined with a small shake of his head. Elijah accepted his, awkwardly fumbling with the packaging. "I read about what happened to you," he said suddenly, quieter this time. "I saw the video. You didn't even fight back. How did you stay calm?" The question hit like sudden turbulence, unexpected, jarring. But Jameson didn't blink. His fingers gently closed the portfolio on his lap. He turned to Elijah and saw not just a student, but a generation watching, waiting for an answer. One that made sense of violence, fear, dignity. He exhaled slowly and said, "Because I knew the world was finally watching." When silence is broken, justice begins to land. They thought they could hide their hatred, but the world was watching live. If you stand for justice, accountability, and truth, hit subscribe and join the channel. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It sheds light on the disturbing realities of racial violence, unchecked bias, and abuse of power in public spaces. By dramatizing an incident of racially motivated assault caught on a live feed, this narrative aims to raise awareness about systemic racism and the urgent need for accountability and justice. Our goal is to provoke thought, inspire empathy, and drive meaningful conversations toward social change.